Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to our joint webinar on the role of certification, social audit, and supplier management tools in human rights due diligence. We're pleased to host this webinar today as part of our collaboration with the Swiss Federal Administration and Focusright in the framework of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights to promote the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. I'm Alice. I lead the thematic work at the Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and I'm very happy to welcome you all today. The objective of our network is to draw the attention of companies to the relevance of social and environmental issues for their activities and to support and enable them in the implementation of responsible practices. So as you see on the slides, we promote 10 principles for companies to act responsibly, and we also ask the companies or welcome the companies to promote and develop innovative solutions to achieve the SDGs. Before we start, I will just give you a few housekeeping rules. So the session is recorded. So just that you all know, the slides and the recording will be made available by us after the webinar. And if you want to ask a question, please write it in the chat so that we can take your questions one after the other when it's the right time. We have a webinar until 11, but I have been told by the team that we can stay a bit longer in case we cannot answer all the questions until 11. So feel free to stay a little longer if you can, and otherwise we can always answer questions by email if there is something that you need to know. Now, today, we will hear and discuss the role of certification, social audits, and supplier management tools in human rights due diligence. We will first have a welcome address by Amina Neves. She's an expert for SECO. We will go on with Matthias Leisinger and Regula Meng from Focusright on sustainability schemes, their contributions, but also their limitations in the implementation of human rights due diligence. We'll have a first Q&A, so make sure to have your questions ready by then. We will have then practical approaches and examples of applying sustainability schemes to support human rights due diligence. We will have Simon Hutter from Fairtrade Max Havelaar Switzerland to do so, as well as Laura Wouters from amfori and Thilo Littbauer from Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. And then we will end with a Q&A. So I hand over to Amina for the welcome by the State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, and I wish you all a very good webinar.
Thank you very much, Alice. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in this webinar. My name is Amina Neves and I work for SECO. I'm going to do a very brief introductory presentation. To begin with, I'm going to tell you about the Confederation's strategy, the strategy of the Swiss government regarding business and human rights and the activities in this area. And then I'm going to shortly illustrate the legislative developments. So now we are going over to the Swiss National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So the Swiss government promotes responsible business conduct by various strategies in the economic, social, and environmental field. At international level, the two reference standards are the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. To strengthen the implementation of these standards, the Federal Council, the Swiss government, adopted an action plan for corporate social responsibility and a national action plan on business and human rights. The National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights aims to support companies with measures. So the government expects companies to perform human rights due diligence, and especially for companies like SMEs. This is a challenge, managing risks. For this reason, the government develops specific tools, workshops, webinars, guidelines, brochures that facilitate the implementation of human rights due diligence. Most companies use private certifications and labels to ensure compliance with social and environmental standards in the value chain. For example, Max Havelaar or audits, and the Swiss government wishes to help guide companies um, on the content of these certifications, so that enterprises know which standards covers human rights due diligence under the UN guiding principles um, for human rights. And today's webinar will hopefully be helpful in this regard. Now, going over to the legislative developments. The issue of responsible corporate governance has become more important and binding in recent years. The popular initiative in Switzerland on responsible business has triggered a broad debate. The indirect counter proposal, which came into force in 2022, legalizes certain aspects of corporate responsibility. The European Union enacted also new provisions on sustainability reporting in 2022, and these are also applicable to large Swiss companies through a third country regulation. In addition, Swiss suppliers of EU companies will be indirectly affected. And moreover, the EU directive in the area of due diligence for responsible corporate governance is expected to be adopted in 2024. Now, in Switzerland, the federal administration will prepare a consultation draft for the adoption of Swiss legislation on sustainability reporting by July 2024 at the latest, and examine its consequences for the Swiss economy. There will be also an analysis of the consequences of the EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence in greater depth by the end of 2023. So you see there is a lot ongoing actually. Now, regarding the advantages of due diligence procedures, because irrespective of action plans and legislation, it is important to mention what due diligence means for businesses. The COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on supply chains around the world and highlighted the strong interconnection of the global economy. It showed that companies that exercise human rights due diligence and include all the stakeholders in their activities are much better prepared for all the crises. Today, many companies view the observance of human rights as an issue of strategic importance, and it helps avoid reputational damage, improve the positioning on the market, and increase the competitive edge. Many large companies illustrate their commitment in publishing sustainability reports. Going now to the next slide, we have a website of the Swiss government. This was launched within the National Action Plan. It contains a lot of guidance and brochures for all enterprises, also for SMEs, and it provides an overview of the topic of business and human rights, and there is a wealth of information which can be found. Ladies and gentlemen, now to conclude. The Swiss government uses the means of influence at its disposal to encourage and require companies to respect human rights in a way that is proportionate to the risks. In order to meet the government expectations, companies are invited to integrate human rights due diligence procedures. Respect for human rights has become an issue at strategic importance for many companies since the indirect counter proposal came into force, the legislations. There are binding rules in Switzerland for child labor and conflict minerals. So, to conclude, in general, the Federal Council is aiming for a coordinated approach at international level, is monitoring international developments to ensure that Switzerland is not placed at a disadvantage in international comparison, and promotes the implementation of human rights due diligence and the standards. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amina, for this introduction and for giving a bit of context also on the what's ongoing on an international level. My name is Regula Meng. I'm from Focusright, and I'm happy to be here today together with Matthias Leisinger and to give you this introduction about what is the role of these sustainability schemes, as we call it, in human rights due diligence. How do these two pieces kind of fit together? We have conducted lots of webinars and workshops after the 2 years, and this was one of the key questions that came up a lot. And so it's really great that we can have this opportunity today to dig in a little bit deeper into this question. So what are voluntary sustainability schemes? What do we even mean by this term? Basically, we have made our own very broad definition of voluntary sustainability schemes. And what we mean is basically any kind of voluntary sustainability standards, membership initiative, platforms, IT tools, certification that have a common objective. And basically, the objective that we refer to is to provide support for companies when they try to identify and manage their social or environmental issues in their value chain. Typically, the support is focused on the upstream value chain, but it really depends on the scheme. And of course, this is a really rich and diverse landscape of these sustainability schemes, with more and more schemes coming up over time. And there have been helpful classifications made of these schemes, for example, by the ITC standards map or by the standards compass of the German help desk Business and Human Rights. So we're not really going into in more detail into the classification of these schemes, but if you're interested, these are two really good reference points that kind of group the schemes in different categories. In terms of the services offered by the organizations or the service providers behind these schemes, it's also very broad, and the classification is sometimes difficult because you might have one organization that offers a combination of different services, and services could include, for example, social audit methodologies, like, for example, amfori BSCI or SA 8000 could be the offer of certification or label in the realm of sustainability, like, for example, the Fairtrade certification or the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil certification. They could offer as well sustainable supplier management tools or management supplier evaluation tools, like, for example, SEDEX or EcoVadis. They could be sustainability risk data providers like Maplecroft, RepRisks, or Integrity Next. And there are different organizations that also offer, in combination with other services, an exchange of know-how, sector collaboration, or even support in production countries when it comes to joint project implementation, like, for example, Fairtrade does, but also the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles that we both have here present in this webinar. So when we speak about voluntary sustainability schemes, this is basically what we mean. I know it's very broad and that generalization is possible, but of course, only up to a certain point. And when we evaluate the role of an individual schemes to human rights due diligence, of course, we always need to look also very much in detail of what the specific scheme offers. Now, I know that a lot of the people that we have in the webinar today, they already know what human rights due diligence is, so please bear with me when I do, for the ones who don't know it yet, a really brief introduction of what is human rights due diligence. Basically, it refers to a management system that the company as a whole implements. And this management system has the objective to avoid negative impacts on people and on the environment that is caused either by the company itself, so by its own actions or emissions, or also by all of the actors in the company's upstream and downstream value chain to which the company is connected to. So this is really, when we speak about human rights due diligence, what we mean is this management system that focuses on environmental and human rights impacts. As we heard before from Amina, there are different international standards that kind of outline how exactly companies should implement this management system. And for example, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, or the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And basically what these standards say is that human rights due diligence is implemented in a continuous management process that has 6 elements. So first, it's about adopting a policy commitment where the company really makes clear and expresses that it has a commitment to respect human rights. Then the company conducts a human rights risk and impact assessment so that it really knows, it identifies which are the key topics, which are the key human rights risks that the company needs to focus on. In the next step, it takes risk-based measures that are really strategically linked to that risk identification, and then targets the risks that have been identified in order to seize or prevent or mitigate the negative impacts that have been identified. In the next step, the company also embeds respect for human rights into its internal processes and policies, also into other functions, for example, in the procurement process, in the human resources process, in internal audit, and so on. And the company also tracks and communicates externally, but also internally about how it implements human rights due diligence, and it monitors how effective are the different measures that are being taken. And then the last requirement is that the company also establishes a grievance mechanism through which potentially impacted people or other interested people along the value chain can reach out to the company and can really communicate to the company when they feel that they have been adversely affected. And the company also should provide a remedy, so kind of to reestablish the rights of the people who have been negatively affected by its activities or the activities of partners along the value chain. So this is a really quick run through the whole due diligence process. For those who want to know more, there is a lot of information available. We have created a practical guide that kind of gives you a bit of context on each of the elements. We have a new explainer videos. If you just have 3 minutes and want to hear it in other words and in a very nice language, this is where you can go to. And there is also the recording of an introductory webinar that we did just on this process. So feel free to dig in a little deeper on human rights due diligence. But today we'll focus on how to apply sustainability schemes as part of this management system, as part of human rights due diligence. And to illustrate this with a practical example, we have invited also today a special guest, which is Matthias Leisinger. He is the sustainability manager of the fictive Swiss retail company. Welcome, Matthias.
Good morning.
If you could briefly introduce the company, please.
Yes, of course. Good morning from my side. So I'm representing a Swiss retail company based in Switzerland. We have roughly 8,500 employees in Switzerland, do a lot of retailing in bigger and smaller cities, but we also have some employees that are not in Switzerland, mainly in sourcing countries in Asia. So we are a classical retail organization that does a lot of sales of food, personal care, textiles, electronics. We roughly have a portfolio of 12,000 products. We do have our own brands and international brands. So when we talk about own brands, we have a lot of own branded textiles and food, which are produced in factories in Switzerland, but also we have a lot of suppliers we work with in Bangladesh, for example, in Pakistan and China when it comes to textiles.
Thanks for this introduction. So you told me beforehand, Matthias, that your company has started to implement human rights due diligence and that you have just conducted a high-level risk assessment to identify the company's salient human rights issues. Could you give us a brief overview of where you're currently standing with regards to your due diligence process?
Yes, of course. So what we have done systematic analysis of the human rights issues and the risks along the full value chain. And then we also prioritize those human rights risks in line with the requirements as they are outlined in the UNGPs. As a result of the process, then we have identified those 8 salient human rights risks that we now want to focus on. So we look into child labor, for example, living wage, occupational health and safety, working conditions, amongst others. So the main focus now is to define measures, and as you can see, that the key risks are in the upstream value chain when it comes to the production of raw materials, the processing of those raw materials, and the production of final products. So as we have limited leverage there, so we want to find out what we can do and identify measures in the agricultural production, for example. So the main challenge now is to find the best measures to address those issues. And we want to use certain voluntary schemes as part of our risk-based measures. So, I mean, my challenge now as a sustainability manager, I get a lot of very nice offers. There are a lot of tools out there. So it's very difficult for me to choose schemes, initiatives, and I'm really not sure which one are the best for us. So could you help me to give us some direction, Regula?
Yeah, so thank you for that outline. And I think the point where you're at with this high-level risk assessment in place is a really good place to start thinking about which sustainability schemes best supports your human rights due diligence going forward. And I think one of the first points that you need to consider and need to pay attention to when you start working with these schemes as part of due diligence is really what elements of the value chain you want to target with the sustainability schemes. We have heard before that as part of human rights due diligence, really one of the key principles that human rights due diligence needs to cover the full value chain, really from the agricultural production to the very end of the end of life stages of your products. So most sustainability schemes, and this is one of the key differences, their scope really focuses on maybe one or two stages of the value chain. So they might be focusing on agricultural production, they might be focusing on the final processing stage, for example. But most schemes don't have this full scope covered that you're required to do as part of human rights due diligence. And so now, based on your risk assessment that you already did, you know which topics you want to prioritize, and you know at which stages of the value chain they are most severe. So this is a really good start for the selection of the sustainability schemes, because now you can evaluate based on this information which schemes that best cover the value chain stages that you want to target with your measures. You mentioned before, so you have, for example, at the stage of agricultural production, some of the issues that are really important are child labor and living income. And then you could, for example, make use of a certification scheme that covers these topics. What you need to keep in mind is really when you think of this required scope of human rights due diligence is to keep in mind the stages of the value chain that are not covered by the sustainability schemes that you work with. So don't forget to implement necessary measures also there. For example, with regards to your own operations, with regards to transport and logistics, this is a topic that often gets forgotten, with regards to the user phrase and so on.
Okay, thanks a lot. That helps already a lot to make this assessment. So for example, now, if we would choose to buy certified raw material for our products, so for example, certified coffee, can I then tick the box? Is this enough in terms of measures to address the identified risks, for example, with regards to agricultural production in coffee, or do we need to do more?
Yeah, this is an important question. So when is a specific measure enough to address the identified risk? And here, what's important to consider is what we heard before also in the introduction from Amina, that what is required is really that the measures are proportional to the risks. So this means that the more severe a human rights risk or impact is, then the more comprehensive and also the stronger a measure needs to be. So when you evaluate if the use of a specific sustainability scheme is enough to address the specific issues, or if more measures are needed, then you can check which limitations does the selected scheme have compared to the key principles of human rights due diligence. And I have summarized a couple of these limitations or requirements or fundamental principles of human rights due diligence on this slide. And so, for example, when we start thinking about the first element, the thematic scope of the scheme. So here what you could check is which human rights and labor rights are covered by the scheme that you have selected. More specifically, are your salient human rights issues that you have identified and then that you want to prioritize to work on, are they covered? Or are there some issues that you would need another additional measure to make sure that this is also covered? So the thematic scope is one of the limitations that these sustainability schemes can have, and that you might want to cover with additional measures. The next point is also the personal scope in terms of which groups of potentially affected people are covered by the schemes. Often the sustainability schemes, they limit their scope to formal, for example, suppliers' own staff, the more formal workforce, but they might not always cover other people that are not formally connected to the company, like for example the neighboring communities, maybe informal workers, maybe the children of the formal workers, and so on. So here also kind of what you can do is double check which are the groups of people that are covered, and are these really the groups of people, or are all of the important groups of people that you have identified beforehand, are they already covered? And then last but not least, with regards to the methodology, according to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the meaningful engagement with affected people or potentially affected people is a really key principle of human rights due diligence. And here the question that you could check to evaluate if you need to do something more is to really check to what extent does the sustainability scheme that you're considering already have meaningful consultations of rights holders. So who exactly do they speak to, in what form, for how long, to how many people, and so on. And so basically by identifying these gaps, limitations, you can decide if there is an additional measure needed in order to fulfill kind of these fundamental principles of human rights due diligence, or if you feel like for this specific issues at this specific stage of the value chain, you're confident that the sustainability scheme already offers what you can do. So for example, agriculture production, you mentioned before. Additionally, you could do an in-depth risk assessment at the prioritized site, for example, that could focus more on the root causes of the identified human rights issues, that could add some meaningful consultation of potentially affected people, maybe also of some neighboring communities. That might be a good complement. And then based on the insight from this in-depth risk assessment, you could also implement some additional projects to kind of address the identified issues, for example, living wage for farmers. So this is really kind of ideally you would have the schemes and then also some complementary measures for severe risks and impacts. So here, what is really important is that the schemes, they are only a supporting tool of human rights due diligence. It's not a substitute for it. So if you want to check the box, it's not really a way that you can check the human rights due diligence box just by using these schemes.
Okay, thank you. So we are also working, you showed the circle at the beginning in terms of human rights due diligence core elements. So we are also working and improving measures on other elements of the due diligence process, like we want to set up a grievance mechanism through which affected rights holders can make complaints in case of adverse impacts. So can those schemes, those voluntary sustainability schemes, also help us on that?
Yes, it's a really good question, because the sustainability schemes, they can contribute to human rights due diligence all along the different elements. So for example, as you said, the UNGPs, they require that the company sets up a grievance mechanism so that potentially affected people can make a complaint in case of adverse impacts. And this grievance mechanism then needs to be accessible and effective for the affected people or for the targeted people. So it can be really helpful here with regards to the grievance mechanisms to also rely on voluntary sustainability schemes that sometimes offer these mechanisms as well, so that you can increase access to grievance and remedy for people along your value chain. Because maybe your internal mechanism, you might have a compliance hotline or a speak up hotline, and maybe it's hard to reach people at certain stages of the value chain with that internal mechanism that you have. So that's really good then to complement and really make use of different schemes that cover different target groups along the value chain. Another example from the different elements and how sustainability schemes can contribute to the different elements is also with regards, for example, to the human rights risk and impact assessment. So for example, you're conducting your human rights risk assessment, and you already have some information that were gathered through social audits in your upstream supply chain. So this can be a really good source of information, complementary source of information, of course. And you can use these insights from these audits to also give a bit more depth to your risk assessment, and you can include that information in your risk assessment process. And then last but not least, I'm not going through all of the examples here on this slide. If we speak about embedding your respect for human rights in your own processes, so really, how can you enhance your internal due diligence processes with these schemes? And for example, here you could use an IT-based sustainable supply chain management tool. A lot of companies do that, for example, to increase traceability of some prioritized high-risk value chains and to gather relevant information from your suppliers and sub-suppliers. So there are lots of different ways in which you can complement what you already do for each of these elements with these voluntary sustainability schemes. And what's important here, maybe, is that the responsibility for making sure that the company respects for human rights, it always stays with your company. You cannot outsource it through the use of these schemes.
Okay. Thanks a lot. So I have one last question, Regula. So you mentioned also those supplier management tools. So we already make use of different supplier sustainability management tools. So we ask, for example, all our suppliers to fill in an online questionnaire as part of the onboarding process. And we get a lot of data. So we get a lot of information through this tool, and sometimes we are not really sure how to manage the amount of information and data we receive. Can you give us some information, and do you have suggestions how to deal with this data overflow sometimes?
Yeah, so I think one of the key recommendations with regards to these sustainable supply chain management tools is to really keep in mind some of the key principles of human rights due diligence when we apply them. And one of the key principles is really to take a risk-based approach, take a targeted approach to identify or to managing the human rights related issues. So I think how you said, these tools can generate a lot of information. So I think it's important to not overburden also your suppliers, because you're probably not the only clients who wants to have this kind of information. So not to overburden suppliers with information requests and create piles of data that you ultimately don't have a use for. So here the recommendation would be to apply these tools in a risk-based and targeted way. So basically you don't ask for data that you don't need. And so, for example, here, this can also play together with the risk assessment that you previously did. And when you have identified, for example, which are the products, which are the raw materials or the value chains that you have with the most severe risk from a human rights perspective. And then you could use, for example, a supplier management tool that focuses then on these high-risk areas and high-risk suppliers. They could support you in tracing back specific supply chains. They can support you in asking really targeted questions about the key human rights issues that you want to work on in collaboration with the suppliers. So the goal of the information request that you would use the information that you get from your suppliers as an entry point for a more in-depth dialogue on the human rights issues and really start collaborating and working on these issues together. And here an additional point that it's important to consider is not only with regards to the quantity of the data that you collect, but also with regards to the data quality, because there might be a conflict of interest potentially for some of your suppliers when they fill in sustainability related questionnaires, because if some of your suppliers might be worried that there might be negative consequences in case they disclose any human rights issues to you, to their customers, if they're worried that you might terminate a contract, if they have identified cases of child labor and they're not exactly sure on what to do next. So there it's important that you're aware of this possible conflict of interest and also check the information received on plausibility and not just blindly trust the information that you receive.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot, Regula, for sharing your insights, and we certainly will consider this in our future action plan and roadmap development. Thanks a lot, Regula.
Thank you, Matthias. And now this was a really quick overview of some of the first key points when working with these sustainability schemes. We have just published this week a new Q&A for companies that is really focusing on all of these questions. It goes a lot more in depth than what we have seen today. It's available in 4 languages on the website from the Swiss government that you have also heard about before. So this is also an invitation if you want to know more, to dig in a little deeper. There's sources also linked to more information. And so we're happy that we can share this with you today. So now we have a little bit of time for a first round of questions and answers. And I saw that we have a first question in the chat, and I think about the identification of risks and what level of supporting documents is required for the identification of risks. Ash asks, would the overall discussion with the supply chain team and search for publicly available info be enough? Matthias, do you want to answer that first question?
Yes, I briefly can do this, and I also recommend, I just posted the link to those webinars and guidance when we deep dive on risk analysis and how to conduct risk assessments. I think what is important is that you take different sources. You can talk to internal stakeholders, certainly. For example, procurement, they have a lot of information. HR usually has a lot of information. And there's a lot of excellent publicly available information out there, as we have Fairtrade here on also in the webinar today. I mean, the risk map of Fairtrade can be an excellent source to assess risks and to understand risks in a global context. To have the CSO risk check, that can be an excellent tool. So there are different tools that give you a more generic overview of risks in a specific sector, for a specific raw material, and or specifically for certain countries. So actually, it is important to use different elements of information. And I think what is important to mention here is that you do not need to have full traceability of your supply chain to do such a risk assessment. I mean, if you're working in cocoa or you're working in coffee, there's a lot of information out there that can give you a good overview on potential human rights risks in the sector, in your value chain, without having full traceability. But I really recommend to have a look into the webinars we did also together with, in line with the NAP sensibilization workshops and collaboration with Global Compact.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions on this first part? You can write it in the chat. And if not, I think we can already move on, and we have more time for questions later, also to the different speakers from the sustainability schemes that we have invited today. And basically what we have done is to we have invited people from organizations that cover, among other things, different stages of the value chain. So we have Simon Hutter from Fairtrade Max Havelaar Switzerland. She will tell us more about how Fairtrade certification at the stage of agricultural production can help companies kind of to manage risk related to that stage. Then we have Laura Waters, who is a sustainability expert at amfori, who will tell us more about social audit methodology of amfori BSCI and how they can help us, or can help companies at the stage of more the closer to the own company. So for example, the direct suppliers that are processing the final products. And then we have Thilo Liedelbauer from the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, and he will tell us more about how the partnership helps its member companies to embed human rights into their internal processes, for example, by adapting their own purchasing practices. So, of course, all of these 3 organizations, they offer a lot more than they're going to talk about today. So they have a lot of different support services available to companies, also covering other elements of the value chain and also other elements of human rights due diligence. So of course, with regards to time today, we ask them just to focus on one small piece of the work or of the services that they offer. And I think it gives a really good overview of how these sustainability schemes can be used, can be combined with own activities from companies to really support the whole human rights due diligence process. And with this, I would hand over to you, Simon, for the presentation on how Fairtrade can help companies to address risks at agricultural production.
Thank you very much, Regula. Can you see my slides already?
I can see them, yes.
Okay, great. So good morning also from my side. I'm a project manager for international cooperation and the human rights due diligence expert at Fairtrade Max Havelaar Switzerland. And I'm glad to explain you today how Fairtrade can support your due diligence efforts, as Regula mentioned, with a focus on agricultural production of raw materials. So as recommended before by Regula, we would start here with the identified salient issues. So the full palette of what Matthias showed as a retailer before. You have your salient issues, and now as a company, you're trying to find out how Fairtrade certification can support as a tool to mitigate and prevent these issues. So the key questions to answer that is what is Fairtrade scope? What is Fairtrade salient issues that we are covering, and Fairtrade's due diligence functions. Here, first of all, you see the scope, what supply chain actors are covered. We don't have time today to really explain the Fairtrade system in detail, but I want to show you in red that we cover various actors of the supply chain, but the focus of today's webinar is producers, so production of raw materials. And it's also where the interventions we have in place are strongest. What products are we covering? So we have banana, cocoa, coffee, cotton, flowers, sugar, etc. And we can tell that these are the key products, and it's 90% of the farmers and workers are producing or working in these products. So this is also where we have the greatest leverage. But we also have many more products. And I advise you to look at the Fairtrade risk map for the full list of products. You will also receive the slides later on, so you can also click on the links. Then what countries are covered? We have over 70 countries in which producers are working. It's 70% of the producers are located in Africa and the Middle East, and 30% in Latin America, Caribbean, and in Asia Pacific. And here also the details on the countries can be found on the risk map. Then, very importantly, once you found out if the actor is covered and the location is covered, which salient issues are covered. So we can say that we are a good tool to address and mitigate the following salient issues because they are covered in our standards. So child labor, child rights, forced labor, gender rights, labor rights, living income, living wage, discrimination, but also environmental rights such as water and biodiversity, but also climate change and deforestation. But as you imagine, the interventions and measures we have in place are very different depending on the topic at hand. So it really is helpful to look at the risk map because we there explain really the interventions we have for every of these salient issues. So for example, for child rights, I don't expect you to be able to read that, but just to show what you can find there. You also find what we do to prevent and mitigate these measures in the standard and beyond the standard, what we do to remediate the standard and facilitate remediation. And you also have a summary of all the requirements we have in the standard to address the issue. And quite importantly, we also we have the generic Fairtrade standards, but we also have product standards which complement the generic standards. And this is quite helpful because there we have, like this, we can also address risks that are associated with the production of this specific product. And also there, it's good to also look into detail of really the product standard if you want to find out how we address the issue. As mentioned, it's different for every of the salient issues, but I still try to make a summary to have a generalized overview to explain a bit how we then, if it's in scope, mitigate, prevent the risks at agricultural production. So first of all, of course, you have the management system that a company implements. I just wanted to represent that of course, it's not a tick the box, and the biggest part would be implemented by the company itself. But then if you use Fairtrade certification to address the risk at production level, you can here mention the Fairtrade, I can mention the Fairtrade standard. It's based on international human rights standards, and it guides producers to implement their processes. And very important, also capacity building, because what we have in the standard is also included for producer networks to support producers with capacity building, training, support, and awareness raising. And this is quite a helpful thing, also a preventative measure from a company perspective, and it's also helpful even if there is no violation found. So it's way more than just auditing and controls. We have over 50 members of staff in producer countries. So this is something quite important to me. Then we have, as I mentioned, the audit and controls. And if there's a non-conformity found, there are corrective measures. And then we have the Fairtrade minimum price and the premium. So this allows producers to invest in their human rights challenges and also invest in implementing the processes we want from them. This is also helpful because, as you all know, poverty and low prices is a key driver of many or a cause of many human rights challenges. So this can also be a risk-reducing measure to improve your purchasing practices as a company. Then we have participation of rights holders. As you might know, we are the system is in a way that 50% of decision-making power rests with the producers, and we have ongoing dialogue because we have the producer networks located in the countries where the producers are. So this is quite an essential part of our work. And here you can see what would be in generalized way included in a Fairtrade certification, so sourcing on Fairtrade terms. But then beyond that, we work with other actors to address root causes. Then we have programs and projects to go beyond that and really focus on some specific salient issues. And also we have some monitoring and evaluation work to really track how efficient and impactful the measures are, and we communicate about that. And of course, this is an illustration, and of course, it depends on the risk at hand, and it depends on other measures the company has and how much of the volumes they source on Fairtrade terms. As you can imagine, you have way more impact if you have 100% certified products than if you have like really low percentage. But I still try to summarize it in a way that it's a bit providing an overview. Then to make it a bit less abstract, I mentioned the programs and projects, and I wanted to give you an example. We have over 150 programs and projects around the globe. I recommend you to look at the project map for a full list. But I would mention here a child labor, community-based child labor monitoring and remediation system. It was mentioned by Regula that it's always important to know if the measures in place are, first of all, efficient and sufficient. And if there is a really high risk, of course, you need to do more. So in Ghana, for example, as you all know, the risk of child labor is systemic and really high. So also certification won't solve the problem alone. So we have a lot of companies that co-invest in additional measures, also co-invest in strengthening the ability of the cooperative to also remediate when they identify the cases. This is a very important part. So of course, much more needs to be done depending also on the salient issues, so on the prioritized risks you have found out based on your risk analysis. And it's a continuous process, so you also, of course, have to see how effective this is and if you need to build upon that and have additional measures. So to summarize, I can say that indeed Fairtrade is a tool to address negative impacts at the stage of agricultural production for the issues that are covered in the standard. We are regularly revising the standard to make sure we are including the salient issues in the commodities and countries we work with. We're also currently revising the standard to make sure also the processes are aligned with UN guiding principles, the processes that producers are required to implement based on the standards. You might have also participated in the consultation during summer. And then beyond that, you see in the purple intersection, it's also advised to go beyond that and with programs and tailored expertise. We can also support that. So thank you very much for the attention. And if you have questions, I think we can answer them later. Please put them in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, for this excellent overview. I know it's not easy to explain that everything in 10 minutes. I just want to quickly also take up one comment, a very important comment that we have in the chat. Pabla wrote that I feel risk is often interpreted as a risk to the company, whereas it is about the risk that vulnerable people in the value chain face. And that's a really important point. I didn't make that clear in my introduction. I think it was maybe a little bit too short. So really, when we speak from a human rights due diligence perspective, when we speak about risk, it's like Pabla says, it's about risk to the people. So it's the risk that a person suffers an adverse impact on their human rights, and it's not about the risk to the company. So for some, this new risk perspective, or taking on this new risk perspective, we're really focusing on the risk to people and not on the risk to the company, needs some getting used to, because of course it's not about reputational risk to the company, but it's really about making sure that the well-being of the people, that the human rights of the people are respected. So thanks for this comment. And with that, I would like to hand over to Laura Waters from the amfori initiative, who will tell us a bit more about their work. Thank you, Laura.
Indeed, thank you so much. First, can you see my slides?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Yes. Okay, let's right on. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited today to speak a bit about our services at amfori and how they can help you support in your journey. I do want to underline what has been said before, in the sense that it's up to, of course, US company to how you use these tools and systems available. The more input and engagement we see from members, the more that we see the value also taken out of these tools. So it's also very much an individual journey. But so first, I just quickly like to introduce amfori. So who we are a business association, and we help enable our international members to be more sustainable, to help them in their diligence journey by helping them improve the environmental, social, and governance performance of their value chains. So we have services that deal with the social impact, and we have services that deal with the environmental impacts, and now we're also working on services that deal with the governance impact. That's a little bit more of a recent working area of us. And so we strongly believe that a focus on people, planet, and profit can go hand in hand, and that we can help our members supporting to do this. And so we indeed cover several steps throughout the value chain. But the biggest part that we cover, of course, is production facilities and factories of our members. So we have a bit of a very diverse membership base. We are an asectorial organization. That means that we cover several different sectors. So, for example, both garment and agriculture is covered, but also household goods and many more. And so you can also see that represented in our membership with regards to which kind of companies we are representing. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that we have both SMEs and bigger companies within the membership. So that's also, of course, also always very important for us to make sure that we keep that in mind when we are building our tools and services, that they fit both an SME, let's say, angle, as well as a larger company as well. So what are our solutions? And I think the main one I want to speak about today is, of course, our amfori BSCI program, or social due diligence. But I do want to highlight, so as you can see here, our products are really in 3 pillars. So ESG, for environmental, we have our environmental due diligence offering, which is amfori BEPI. This is an environmental performance audit. It's a little bit different than the classic BSCI audit, so it really works also on self-assessments and really risk assessments in order to guide the process and really have the suppliers be very closely involved. And this has also had a recent revamping, so we've really assessed it and revamped it to the more current standards. Now, what is most well known and what you maybe know better than amfori is BSCI. So this is amfori BSCI. This is our social due diligence tool, our social standards audit that was created over 20 years ago. And so this is our one of our key, let's say, services. Let's say for us, the main advantage here is that we do it collaboratively. So if we have several members sourcing from the same supplier or business partner, the goal is to also reduce audit fatigue and reduce duplication at production locations. And so the goal is really to have one audit with an agreed upon scope and code of conduct that our members can all use in order to reduce audit fatigue on the supplier's side. So I'll go into a bit more detail later on. But basically, there is a score overall and then a score per performance area. And depending on the score, there will be a dedicated continuous improvement trajectory with trainings and follow-up based on, let's say, the topic and the degree of severity. We also have a zero tolerance protocol integrated into the BSCI. That means that if the auditor during the audit finds what we call a zero tolerance infringement, so certain topics that have to be remediated right away, they will flag that immediately. They will not wait to publish the audit report and go into continuous improvement. Child labor is such a case, for example. If child labor is detected during the audit, it is flagged right away and needs to be dealt with right away in collaboration with the members. Finally, we also have governance due diligence, and here we have a couple of tools, amfori QMI, which is a quality management initiative, amfori Speak to Change, and amfori Insights. Now, the one that I'd really like to pull up here is amfori Speak for Change, which is our grievance mechanism. So we are implementing a supply chain grievance mechanism for our members, which is currently active in Vietnam, Turkey, and Bangladesh, and will be added in about 2 weeks in parts of India. And here we really saw the value in having this collaboratively, as was mentioned before. We have members collaborating on social standards through BSCI. So it made a lot of sense for us to also leverage this collaboration with regards to dealing with issues and remediating issues that come up throughout their supply chains and value chains. And so the key thing here is that if you collaborate as companies together on this, there's a lot more leverage, a lot more impact you can have. It also means that it requires less resources, which is specifically relevant for SMEs, because setting up an accessible grievance mechanism that is available in the local language, that has adapted access channels, can be a significant challenge for companies. And as such, it can be, let's say, more impactful if they do so collaboratively. We have a couple of services and tools that support these products. So we have a platform where we manage everything with regards to audits, continuous improvements. We have the academy where we do the trainings. And then we also have amfori advocacy where we really represents our members' views on a policy level. A couple of numbers, and these numbers are from 2022. We hope to have better, of course, more numbers by the end of the year. But so you present over 2.4 thousand members internationally. So these are, let's say, the end companies. They are mainly in the US and in the European Union, but we have some, for example, in Asia, specifically Hong Kong as well. They come from 48 different countries and are really across different sectors. Now, when we look to producers, which is factories, producing facilities, we have 56,000 engaged producers on the platform. This means that they are involved in audit cycles. They are over 110 countries. And in 2022, we did over 35,000 audits, including both BSCI and BEPI. Now, we strongly work on training sessions, both online and face-to-face, to, let's say, build the awareness and knowledge level of all participants, specifically suppliers. But of course, is also relevant when we go into a continuous improvement trajectory after a certain BSCI score, for example. So what is the BSCI structure if we're talking about social due diligence? So we define the amfori BSCI implementation strategy. This is the planning that happens both together with the members and the suppliers. And they integrate the code of conduct. So the code of conduct is really something that both our members and their suppliers undersign, and can in some instances, of course, also be more stringent than local labor law. And then the idea is that both members and suppliers integrate these requirements into their core policies and processes. This is followed by a check, which is where we assess the internal and the supply chain performance. This can happen through various ways, but of course, the biggest one and the most well-known one is the BSCI audit. Depending on the score and the outcome of the BSCI audits, we implement continuous improvement measures. For example, if something was picked up with regards to wage practices, there might be specific remedial actions with regards to these wage issues, depending again on the outcome. So this is, I think, one of the main interesting things. If a supplier has a very good score overall, but there's one point that is currently facing some issues, we will specifically focus the training on that specific issue and not a general overall training. These are the 13 performance areas of the BSCI Code of Conduct. You can see they cover a range of issues going from remuneration to decent working hours to child labor to occupational health and safety. One of the main ones that I'd like to highlight here is the first one, which is on the social management system and the cascade effect. So we ask suppliers to, of course, the cascade effect means that they should also require this from their suppliers. So this is where we see the cascade effect go into motion, and that we hope to have, let's say, an effect across all tiers of the supply chain. And then the second one is the workers' involvement and protection, including grievance mechanisms. So as I highlighted before, we are working on the supply chain level grievance mechanism, but we also have a clear inclusion in the Code of Conduct in Performance Area 2 that all suppliers should have an operational level grievance mechanism at factory level of their own. That means that ideally many issues can be resolved at factory level, which is usually also the best place to be resolved, because many, let's say, lower scale issues, it goes a lot faster if they can be resolved there. It also promotes trust in the organization. And so as such, we work on 2 levels there. So this is a bit of an overview. So let's say that the overall score is an A rating, for example. That means also that the rating cannot be lower than a certain level across all performance areas. So if a certain performance area scores very low, the overall score can also, it impacts the overall score. So it's not just an addition of the numbers. It really has, let's say, a trigger effect, and some questions or areas that are verified have a bigger impact than others. For including health and safety has a very big impact on the overall score. The zero tolerance is something that is implemented. So if we see something very serious and we address right away during the audits that we cannot address during continuous improvement afterwards. Examples are, for example, child labor. This is workers who are younger than 15 years old. From the moment they're 15 years old, we go into young worker status. In China, that's below 16. Workers younger than 18, for example, and that are subjected to forced labor or that are subjected to dangerous or hazardous labor, that's also a significant issue. Bonded labor is not allowing workers to leave the workplace, forcing them to work, dealing with recruitment fees, for example. When you think about bonded labor, we often think about modern slavery, but recruitment fees are a very significant part of that. Inhumane treatment, flagrant violations of occupational health and safety, and unethical business behavior. That means any attempt at bribery, misrepresentation in supply chain, under declaring the size of the workforce or hiding certain documents that we need to verify, for example, the wage situation on the pay slips. If we go into our access to remedy overall, I just want to highlight quickly what we've been discussing beforehand, because you see this is becoming significantly more important for companies and specifically also our members. You see in the blue that we have the operational level grievance mechanisms, which we call OGMs. Everything that we do is aimed at strengthening these. So we have significant training there, awareness raising throughout our member supply chains and value chains. But we do see that sometimes workers do not trust these mechanisms or they do not work. And as such, we're also implementing the amfori supply chain grievance mechanism, which is there to provide access to remedies where grievances cannot or have not been dealt with through local operational level grievance mechanisms. And then the interesting thing is here is also that amfori supply chain grievance mechanism, or Speak for Change, is available not only for workers, but communities, local NGOs, trade unions, and many more, because they can also represent, let's say, vulnerable workers who do not dare to come forward, or communities, for example. So it's open to a whole host of potential complainants. And whenever we deploy, we do make sure that everything is available with several access channels in the local languages, and that we do an awareness raising throughout our suppliers and their reaches. We also work together with local stakeholders and local NGOs, for example, to implement this. Finally, we also have a grievance mechanism about the amfori services and amfori itself. That means that audit quality issues can also be addressed, because this is a significant concern in some countries, for example. So that means that we also have a follow-up there. And then just want to highlight at the end is that we are really working together on collaboration with regards to access to remedy, just to avoid duplication. We know that many of our members have these large supply chains, and that they are members of several, let's say, organizations. And the goal is to have deduplication as much as possible, both in audits, but also in access to remedy efforts. Because what you want to avoid is having suppliers have 10 to 15 posters of different grievance mechanisms up on their wall, because that leads to significant confusion at the level of the worker. So this is a little bit of an overview. There's a lot more information about that detail, but so I thought it was important to mention here, because audits are a very important tool. They give you good insights into where you stand in terms of the performance at the location, but they are a part of the due diligence journey. They are not all that you should be doing. There's a significant part in risk assessment beforehand. There's continuous improvement, and there's also access to remedy throughout. And this is only for the social part. So there's lots to be done. Audits are a very important tool, but I do want to underline they're not the only tool that should be used in terms of assessing the performance in supply chains.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this excellent overview. For the next speaker, we'll Thilo Liedelbauer from the Partnership for Sustainable Textile, and I think he will also present to us a very important and interesting aspects of how these sustainability schemes can support companies in implementing human rights due diligence, because it's of course not only about risks that occur at suppliers or really at the start of the value chain, but it's also about how the own company can maybe adapt some of the practices that make it easier then for actors in the value chain to respect human rights. So thank you very much, Thilo, for being here today and for presenting us this aspect of the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Of course. Yeah, my presentation actually will be split into two parts. So I will give you a short introduction what the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles is about, and then I will give you an example, as Regula already mentioned, how we are active, how MSIs like the partnership can contribute to improve due diligence processes in your own operations, but of course they don't happen in a vacuum, so it takes a whole range of stakeholders to be involved here. So maybe first of all, who are we? We are a multi-stakeholder initiative with 124 members from all areas, so from politics, because the membership is, or the partnership is actually funded by the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the GIZ, which is a development cooperation organization, is hosting the partnership as a secretariat. But we also, of course, have members from the textile industry and from civil society. So all parts of the society are encompassed in this partnership. And so the objective of this partnership is achieving social, environmental, and economic improvements all along the textile value chain. And of course, every member in such a partnership contributes their individual and professional competences, their skills, and their goals. And so we profit, of course, from all the good practices and the lessons learned from the different member organizations. So what of course, there's a certain steering structure behind all this. We have a steering committee and so on, but I won't go into detail about that because of the time. I want to focus more on what we are actually doing is the partnership. So as you can see here in this slide, we have 3 core elements that we are working on. The first one is implementing due diligence. This is connected to a review process that every member has to go through every 2 years, where this is an assessment, so to speak, on different dimensions of risks in the supply chain, and every 2 years, the companies have to show in how far they have improved in those different aspects. Then we have supply chain transparency. So all member companies, of course, are working towards more transparency, and they are also obliged to upload their tier 1 suppliers and publish them via an aggregated list. So, and we also are recording incidents that come from these suppliers. So this is what we are doing on transparency. And then the most important aspect for today, at least, is addressing the focus topics. So you can see here that the partnership has 4 different focus topics: living wages and purchasing practices, circular economy and climate protection, gender equality and grievance mechanisms and remedy. And in those white boxes, you see there that behind these different focus topics, there lie always a common framework, individual commitments, and joint action. Joint action meaning also projects that are working on these focus topics by the different members. And what I want to focus now is addressing, just to pick out an example, addressing living wages and purchasing practices. And for that, I want to go into the learning and implementation community. But first of all, maybe why is purchasing practices something that you should be focusing on as a company? Of course, your purchasing practices have very much an impact on human rights or on risks in the supply chain. Just to give you an example, if you in the textile supply chains, if you do last minute changes to the design or the volume of an order, of course, it will have an impact on the factory or the supplier, because they have different lead times that they have to adhere to. They have suppliers themselves that are affected by that. Then of course, it impacts also the workers, because they have to work overtime. They get no rest days. Maybe they have to make use of temporary workers. And in turn, of course, to close the circle, this will also pose a risk to your own company. Of course, the balance, because as we have seen in the chat, also the more important risk lies in the workers. But it's also important to see that it has certain risk, for example, on the quality of your product, on disrupted supply, for example, to be working on your purchasing practices. So this is maybe the challenge here. And now our members have to decided to become active because, as I already said, the partnership members, they strive to improve their purchasing practices. And we have, as you remember in those boxes, we have a common framework for that, which is called Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices, that has been developed in a cooperation of different multi-stakeholder initiatives. And this is sort of a basic document, a framework on how the different members want to become active on the topic. And this is based on 5 principles. I will show you these later. But the learning and implementation community is now a community which works on implementing these principles into business activities. So this is, and again, remember those white boxes, this is part of this joint engagement that we have as the partnership. So what is the setup here? You can see that there are different members active from different multi-stakeholder initiatives. Actually, the learning community is hosted by another project of the GIZ, the Initiative for Global Solidarity, and different multi-stakeholder initiatives take part in this learning community, and they will have also been involved in developing this common framework. Now to the 5 principles, you can see them here. I won't go into detail about them. I will give you a link to the document in my presentation, which will be sent around. But just to give you a grasp of it, principle 1 is more focused on internal structures. So to get the buy-in of the leadership, to get the buy-in of the purchasing department, for example. And the third and the second principle are then focused on working with your suppliers to get a more equal partnership, to go into to collaborative production planning, to minimize the risks in the supply chain. And the fourth and the fifth principle are more focused on transparency when it comes to costing, when it comes to pricing. So it's more on this living wage aspect I mentioned earlier. And for all these 5 principles, as part of the community, there are different meetings that are taking place, a main session and a sub-session for each of the principles that are happening sequentially. And what I find most important about this is that we always have the suppliers that the companies are engaging with on board there. So they give their input, they describe their challenges, they describe what are some good initiatives, and also the companies have to develop an action plan on how they want to integrate these principles. So this is a short introduction to the learning and implementation community, and maybe as some key takeaways from that, I think that multi-stakeholder partnerships can be a good guidance for improving purchasing practices, but not only that. As you can see, you can work as part of a multi-stakeholder partnerships on very different topics, on a wide range of topics. I think it can pave the way for structural changes, because if you have a framework like this, you have a good leverage to argue inside your companies for changes, for example, in purchasing practices. And I think also communities like these are a good space also to share your own experience, but also to learn from others. And as a last point, maybe as you also see with the learning and implementation community, it can also function as a gateway to get into international communities, to connect with international organizations, which also have their experience and maybe have ideas to bundle efforts to implement common projects, for example, that can then be scaled up to drive a more systematic change. So maybe for more information, you can also visit the website of the Common Framework, and of course, you can contact us at the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thilo, for this very helpful overview also of what companies can do and how they can collaborate as part of these sustainability schemes to really improve their own practices. So before we move on to the final Q&A, I would like to share or pass on the word to Matthias, who will make a couple of conclusions on how to apply sustainability schemes as part of human rights due diligence.
Thank you, Regula, and thanks a lot to all speakers for sharing their insights. And I think it was very helpful to see how the certification schemes can contribute to implementing human rights due diligence and manage risk to people. Also, we learned from amfori how they manage the audit scheme, and then last but not least, Thilo presented how a multi-stakeholder initiative can also support companies in sharing information, making sure that there is appropriate embedding of human rights due diligence in the organization. So what we have seen, just to wrap up briefly, is that I think those voluntary sustainability schemes, they signal a commitment to responsible purchase or to responsible business practices. So if you use work with amfori, or if you're a member of the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, or you work with the certification schemes of Fairtrade, I think it's already a first commitment to responsible business practices, and they can be a helpful tool to support the human rights due diligence. I think what is important, again, to emphasize here and to highlight here, it does not replace a human rights due diligence process. So it is essential to keep the responsibility for due diligence within the company. So those schemes are not a safe harbor for the company. So the responsibility to respect human rights always is within the company and cannot be outsourced. Those schemes assist companies in assessing and identifying, preventing and mitigating human rights risk. They can also be helpful in other elements of the human rights due diligence, as we have seen, for example, when it comes to grievance mechanisms. But there are always limitations that need to be considered. So a case-by-case analysis is very important when choosing those schemes. So consider the contributions and limitations of those specific schemes with regards to your specific company's human rights due diligence. So I think a risk-based approach, a tailored approach is very important here. In our documents, we have prepared some guiding questions for you that can help you to select the right sustainability schemes. So when you do the internal analysis, you can look into those guiding questions and identify for yourself what is needed and what is helpful. So first of all, I think it is the key question, how does the scheme align with the company's strategic objectives? So what do you want to be? Where do you want to go? It's also depending on the then when you look into the ambition level. So is it really also corresponding to your ambition level based on the strategic objectives? So do you want to ensure compliance? You want to be leading? I think that's something you always discuss internally. What is the ambition level, the vision of the company with regards to sustainability and human rights due diligence in general? Then thirdly, which of the salient human rights issues are covered or actually are not covered by the scheme? So whether the topic of child labor is covered or not covered, whether an issue is addressed with regards to indigenous people and or land rights, I think that needs to be assessed by the company. Then it is also important to look into the stages and activities of your value chain. So what we have seen is that schemes look into, for example, the certifications of Fairtrade looks into the agricultural production, but then you also have to better understand, does it also cover, for example, the transportation and also end of life, for example. So that's the next questions you have to ask yourself. And when you look into the core elements of human rights due diligence, so is it a key tool and an entry point to manage risks, or do you rather use it for establishing a grievance mechanism in a tool such as Fairtrade or the Fairway Foundation, also amfori Speak for Change, for example. So the different elements of human rights due diligence that are covered by the scheme, and you also have to understand in what way. important. Coming to the rights holders perspective, again, we're looking into the risk to people. It is important to understand if the scheme involves meaningful consultations of the rights holders, which groups are being consulted. That's another question you can ask yourself. And then also the last question, what support does the scheme offer for actors in the value chain to fulfill the required standards? So I think that's an element that is extremely important, that there's a lot of burden now put on in the value chain, in the supply chain, to the producers, that they have to deal with more and more requirements. I think it's also important that there is capacity building, there is training, there is support, also in dealing with increased prices, increased efforts they have to do to comply with those standards. I think support is a very important element here you have to. With this, I would also briefly mention some podcasts, and we have recently published also in line with the project supported by SECO and together with the Global Compact. There also the link is posted in the chat, and we would be very glad if you just take 2 minutes of your time to fill in the webinar evaluation survey. You also would find the link in the chat. And as this webinar is recorded, and you also have a lot of links to more in-depth information, please feel free to have a look into those materials we have produced in line with the project. With this, I would like to thank again the Global Compact, SECO, and all the speakers, and also Regula for preparing this webinar. And thanks a lot for your active participation. And I think now, as mentioned, we have time until 11:15 just to take up some questions that are already in the chat. And I will quickly hand back, I guess, to Alice for closing the session.
Thank you very much to everyone. It was extremely insightful, very, very interesting. And I still have questions, but I'm not going to ask my questions. I think we would like now to open the floor, right? There are a lot of questions in the chat, if I'm not mistaken. So for the ones of you who need to leave, thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you soon again.